Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the second of our new format of dialogues. My name is Tom Dennis, and I'm the CEO of Serenity and Leadership, which is a culture change consultancy and training organization with a focus on diversity and inclusion. I'd like to introduce Suzie Lewis. Before creating her own company, Transform for Value, Suzie spent 20 years in the aeronautical industry, leading a wide assortment of flagship projects and teams, large and small. Today, she's focused on transforming organizational cultures to bring out the best in people, to bring out the best in their business. As we say here at Serenity and Leadership, organizations thrive when people thrive. Suzie believes passionately in inclusion as a journey, not a project or an event. Suzie, we are kindred spirits, and it's a real pleasure to have you here today. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. For those of you that know me, I have 15 minutes to speak, so that's quite a challenge in itself. So I'm going to try and keep it brief. I'm thrilled to be here today. As Tom says, I'm passionate about inclusion. I'm passionate about what it brings to people and what it can bring in terms of competitive advantage in organizations, but also in terms of well-being in society. So, if I say to you, what is inclusion? I'm sure that I would have as many words as there are people in this virtual room today. But I want to take the hypothesis that inclusion is the fundamental right to equal rights and respect. And that is something that has always fueled everything I've done in work and in home life. But it's also about empathy, curiosity, and listening. And I tried to find some pictures for me that define what inclusion is. And these three sum it up really well. It is about listening and working together. It is about different perspectives, but it's also about authenticity. It's about bringing your digital print or your physical thumbprint, bringing who you are to the table. So that's what inclusion is for me. And we don't all have to agree on that, but this is how I frame inclusion. But I just want to spend a couple of seconds on what it's not, okay? So it's not easy. It's not a nice to have. As Tom says, it's not a project. It's not an event. And it's not a HR subject. Or it's not only a HR subject. I get a lot of people saying to me, but why do inclusion? HR deal with that. And I think a lot of the subjects do fall into the HR basket, so to speak. And there are lots of diversity, measures on diversity and the diversity of populations and the number of women and the different nationalities and the different minority groups. And we have measures like that, and they're often held in a HR dashboard. But research shows that only 20% of existing diversity officers actually look at that data. So we're measuring something, but it's not moving the needle on inclusion. And it's not really being measured for any reason other than to say it's on a dashboard. So I like to think of inclusion as difference. So using difference as a positive lever, but also what makes us the same. So all human beings need belonging, they need respect, they need recognition, and they need to live and work in an environment where they feel valued. So that for me is an inclusive culture. It's about moving to a culture of courage and not a culture of fear. And today in organizations, that isn't necessarily the way the culture works, or the unwritten codes of the culture, or the power structures, or the way the hierarchy works within the organization. And I feel very strongly about that. And people say to me, so what do you mean then, designing for inclusion? So designing for inclusion, what does that mean? I wanted to take three different areas of examples that I thought everyone would probably identify with. First one, meetings. Okay, a culture that is not designed for inclusion. Meetings, you may get shouted over, you may not be able to challenge people, you may not even bother expressing yourself because you don't think anybody's going to listen, and then you just disengage and either talk to your neighbor, look at your phone, or just look out the window. Talent. how familiar does this sound when leaders get territorial? Oh yeah, he's great or she's great, but they're mine. So I am my results, and I want them to do a communal project, but they stay in my team, and I have to have control over them. And promotion. Okay, it took me ages to find this icon for promotion because it was what I wanted to say. It wasn't about any particular person. There wasn't a ladder on it. It was about people rocketing their potential. But today, in terms of promotion, often in organizations, there is less and less diversity as we get up the ladder, so to speak. And the senior positions, sometimes you don't even know they're open and they're filled. So there's a lack of transparency and there's a lack of communication. That is systems that are not designed for inclusion. If I just flip that on its head, systems that are designed for inclusion, meetings, it can be as simple as the leader asking for multiple perspectives, or saying he or she doesn't know, or doing a check-in, making sure that that space is created for everyone's voice to be heard. Or talent. My dream is to crowdsource the definition of talent. What does that mean? Let's take people out of the boxes they're in, and it's not necessarily a linear progression. And here we come to the employee experience. And I love the idea that the employee experience is not what HR says it is, or what business says it is, or what the consultants say it is. It's what the employees say it is. It's whether they feel included and how they experience those processes. So if I go back to promotion, there's a lot of data available now with people analytics where we can see what's happening in these processes, and we can provide transparency across the processes. And then we can do something with that data. So I looked at all these things, and from my time in organizations and observing and trying to understand, I thought, okay, how can I simplify and demystify this subject, which seems to be just seen as, oh, it's something to do with diversity. Yeah, it's something to do with, we need to put KPIs on a dashboard. And I thought, and how can I make it tangible? And I came back to the idea of what is common to all of us. And I think there are three trends, and it's the shift from I to we. So as the world becomes more interconnected, we all need to move from individual to collective. So that's the ego to eco. And you can see this playing out in organizations as they need to look at things like top level processes, like performance management, where you need to stop rewarding individual behavior if you want a collective result. And that means you have to think about systems. So the interconnectedness of different elements, different people, different interactions, human systems part. And then I don't know if you're Star Wars fans, but I am. And Master Yoda there, who always says, you must unlearn what you have learned, for me is the most important thing around what's going on in today's world, and is completely linked to what we need to do for inclusion. Because you need to constantly unlearn what you've learned and relearn how to do things. If I look at something like banking, can you remember the last time you walked into a bank? I can't, because I don't have to. Even before COVID, I didn't have to. I now have an app for that. So it's learning new habits. But if I take the idea of an application and an iPhone, inclusion is changing your operating system. And learning, unlearning, and relearning is around constantly reappraising. Let's take unconscious bias. You have to step out of your own system and look at your unconscious bias to make it conscious. And then what? And that is the key to understanding inclusion, is to always be able to take that step to unlearn what you've learned and look at how you could relearn it. It's essentially curiosity. So I came to my 4 building blocks. I looked and I thought, what's common to everything? What are the foundational blocks to building such an environment, and therefore then to designing on that foundational block? And I chose this on purpose, this picture of the Younger game. I love this game. We play it a lot in my family. But for me, it's really, really about what inclusion's about. It's wobbly. It's made up of lots of different parts. If you pull one of the things in slightly the wrong direction, it can fall over. And if you walk past it without noticing and just walk straight past it, it can fall over. And for me, this is really about the equilibrium of inclusion in organizations. You need empathy. You need to be able to understand what's going on for the other person, how they are experiencing the environment, the invisible parts of the environment, the power systems, the informal dynamics, but also how they're feeling in the team and in the way they're being treated. Psychological safety. we hear a lot about this, is key for me. It's trust, but it's more than trust. And it's not about being nice. It's about giving candid feedback and being able to healthily challenge. So when you feel safe enough in your interpersonal relationships to come as you are and challenge what's going on in the system. So when you have empathy and psychological safety, it brings you to co-responsibility, which is around, we're back to the promotion discussion around accountability of who's responsible for what and what's happening in the system, and taking co-responsibility. So we're taking a step away from the more fear-based blame culture. Okay. And then collective vision. And I think COVID has shown that when the pressure is on and it gets tough, you need a purpose that's bigger than you. And we need a purpose that's bigger than us. But that collective vision, there's no point in doing it with two people and putting it on the wall. You need to come back to the empathy. You need to go and find people who are as different as possible from you and get their perspective and get them to create that collective vision with you. And these 4 areas together form a foundational block that allow you to understand what other people are going through, to empathize with that, and to actually have that co-creative process of, okay, so how can we do things differently? And it can be as small as a meeting, or it can be as big as, let's look at the governance of an organization. This brings me to design thinking. So when I say design for inclusion, it is a little bit of a play on words, because there's the figuratively, I'm going to deliberately design for inclusion, and then the design thinking process, which I'm a massive fan of, partly because it's simple and partly because it makes things tangible. And for me, it creates a frame that brings with it different cognitive and emotional processes for people to think differently about subjects. So you can see in the first 2 areas of empathize and define, let's really understand the needs of the user or the customer or the employee. Let's empathize with these people and see what their needs are, what they feel, and what they're looking for. Ideation. Okay, let's go into a different space and let's create that space of psychological safety where we suspend judgment, there are no right or wrong answers, and we all just, I like to say, pour our heads onto the table and let's see what happens. And that is pure innovation from diverse perspectives. But often, unless you create that space in organizational culture, that isn't the way it works. And then you move on to prototype and testing, which for me is the iterative loop that allows you to define your model. Because as we said right at the beginning, inclusion is very personal and organizational culture is not the same anywhere. So the whole collective vision piece is, let's understand our population together. Let's look at what could be, and then let's look at what works for us. And this is where it comes to designing, prototyping is often used for products, for wireframes, for mock-ups. And I feel very strongly about the fact you can actually make things tangible and prototype approaches. So you can prototype the minimum viable environment, for example. What would it look like? Who would be involved? And what would have to change? And I'm a big believer in you can't manage what you can't measure. And I think we need to start measuring inclusion. And it can be as simple as asking people how they're experiencing the environment. So it's really about centering it around the human being and getting people involved and creating a space where cognitively it's different, and you encourage people to step out of their mental models and to think differently. So we're back to the learn, unlearn, relearn, and the reappraising of what we say to ourselves and of how we show up at work. And I'm conscious of time, so I want to leave you with my last thoughts around this. Understand what inclusion is and what it isn't for you and your community, whether that's a team or an organization. Get curious and speak to people and engage in those courageous conversations. They may not be comfortable, but psychological safety isn't comfortable, but it's incredibly powerful. Listen to what is being said and also to what isn't being said. I'm a big believer in learning by doing. Create developmental practice, new habits, new processes based on employee input or customer input or the input of the people around you. Constantly co-create on the what and the how. We are more intelligent together. Now, in a fast-paced environment where we need to deliver, you think, oh, it's quicker, I'll do it myself, me included. But I've learned, and I now learn to take the step back, because you do go further together. And then role model the right behaviors and use your voice. Everybody has a voice in the system. Use your voice to call out those that don't. We all have a responsibility in an inclusive environment to be an agent of change and to be a choice for how we show up and how we use our voice. And this reminds me of the Maya Angelou quote, which, just to finish, sums it up for me, of people will maybe forget how you make them, what you said and what you did. They will never forget how you made them feel. And that, for me, is when you know that you've created an inclusive environment, when people feel included. Thank you. That's 15 minutes. No, Tom, I was quite...
It's amazing.
I'm quite proud of myself.
Thank you so much. I really acknowledge your self-control to get this down to the tightness, but hopefully that leaves more space for the dialogue, and that's great. We're just about to finish, so Suzie, I wonder whether you'd like to say any final words.
I've got so much to say, but I think I love the optimism. I do think it's an opportunity. I really like the idea of acceleration, but it's not about accelerating what exists today. And I think we've had a lot of discussions around quotas and systemic bias in the system. I think it is about going back to the drawing board and being bold enough and courageous enough to have that conversation of, yes, we need to measure. What are we measuring? And why? And what does inclusion look like? Yes, it needs to come from the top, but I'm also a great believer in grassroots momentum. I think we're getting it from generations, but we're also getting it from people, particularly after COVID, who've had the time to think about what really motivates them and what their purpose is. And they're going to come back into the organization with different expectations and a different voice. So I think, and to take Rachel's point around divergent thinking and, you know, conversations are not enough, which I wholly agree with. But I think we need to change the conversation figuratively and create a space where we can actually act as well as talk about it. So yeah, I think that they're my last thoughts.
Thank you to Suzie for your passion and your words of wisdom. Our next session is in a month's time, the 18th of March, and it's looking at LGBTQ+ with a particular lens on optimizing organizations to be inclusive. So do come back, see us again. And right now, thank you to all. Go well, go safely. Thank you.